Hello and welcome everyone to Day 38's podcast. On this day we're going to cover some materials from chapters 8, 9, and 10, but we're really going to focus on chapter 10 because chapter 10 deals with photosynthesis. You may ask, why are we covering photosynthesis now? This is an earlier chapter and we skipped it. And well, the main reason for this is that photosynthesis and respiration are two crucial pathways that exist in our ecosystem within communities that play this really pivotal role in the success of the individuals within this community. So we think it's an appropriate place to put it. In this first podcast, we're going to cover objectives 1 and 2. As you look at this real briefly, you can see there's a lot of review material, these first two objectives, and an introduction of a couple new terms and some ideas. Well, let's go ahead and get started then. All right, let's begin with photosynthesis. I like how your book opens up this chapter because it really, I think, puts this all in perspective. You know, we have our sun here. We'll make this our sun. And then we have our earth here. And on earth, we have various kinds of photosynthetic organisms. And we've talked about many of these before. We have plants, like our trees here. We may have smaller shrubs here. We also have protists and cyanobacteria. So let's make a list of these, of all the photosynthetic organisms. All plants, some protists, like our green algae, some bacteria, like our cyanobacteria. And let's remember that the distance between the sun and these plants and protists and cyanobacteria is roughly 93 million miles away. Yet, these plants and protists and cyanobacteria are able to take this energy from the sun. So they take this light energy and convert it into chemical energy. And this chemical energy is stored in molecules like glucose. It will make glucose from this light. And again, from 93 million miles away, it captures this light and converts it and turns it into chemical energy in the form of molecules like glucose. And really, this is photosynthesis. This conversion of this light energy into chemical energy. There's also some very useful byproducts that we'll talk about as well. And so why is this important? Well, it's of course very important for the plants because it allows the plants to survive, as well as the protists and the cyanobacteria, anything that undergoes photosynthesis. The ability to capture this light energy really benefits them. But the benefit doesn't just stop at our photosynthetic organisms. Let's think about the food web or food chain that we learned on the last day. Remember, we have our primary producers. These are our autotrophs. Remember, our autotrophs, we might as well define it while we're here. These we can think of as self-feeders. They don't have to eat anything. They can produce all the chemical energy they need in the form of glucose and other organic molecules just by simply taking in carbon dioxide and this light source, this light energy. The primary producers then transfer their energy to the primary consumers. Primary consumers would be things like our herbivores, those that eat plants. These then get taken up by our secondary consumers. And then this goes to our tertiary and on up the line. Let's also review the term heterotrophs. Everything above the primary producers are heterotrophs. They have to get their carbon, their organic material, by ingesting or absorbing those structures from another source. Simply put, they eat other things to get what they need. So we can see now why we want to talk about photosynthesis in this context of the ecosystem, in the context of our communities. Because through photosynthesis, these primary producers survive and thrive. And because they survive and thrive, our primary consumers have something to eat. And because our primary consumers have something to eat, so do our secondary consumers. And again, as we move up the chain. So photosynthesis is critical to this process. And we'll find out that respiration is also critical because these two chemical pathways are intricately linked. Now I want to take a step back and define some other terms and then kind of introduce photosynthesis at a general level, and then we're going to go deeper into this as we move into the second podcast. So let's review some basic terms here. Let's talk about glucose first. Glucose, remember, it's a monosaccharide. It is the basic building block of many of our organic polysaccharides. It is glucose that is made by the plants through photosynthesis that can then be converted into larger structures, which ultimately is why these plants can survive and grow really tall, is because they bring in this carbon dioxide and they convert it into these large organic molecules. You don't need to know the structure of glucose. Just know that glucose is this monosaccharide and it's a product of photosynthesis. We should probably put that here. Next, let's think about ATP. It is a nucleotide, and because it's a nucleotide, it's going to have a sugar. It's going to have our adenine here, and it's going to have our 3 phosphate groups here. And remember, when we talked about this, we talked about these phosphates as being all these negative charges that we push together. And because we push all these negative charges that don't really want to be next to each other, because 2 negatives are going to repel each other, but we force them together. And because of that, we have a tremendous amount of potential energy here. This should all be reviewed, but that's good as we approach our final. This potential energy could also be classified as chemical energy because this is a chemical. And if you remember from way back when, my symbol for energy is an E with a lightning bolt. So when we want to generate energy in a cell, we use ATP because of this 3rd phosphate, which has all this potential energy. When we break this bond, it releases that energy. ADP is going to look very similar. You're going to have your adenine, your sugar, and 2 phosphates. Not having this 3rd phosphate here, there's a lot less potential energy in an ADP molecule. So it is not used as an energy source in the cell where ATP is. Something else we should say about ATP is that we make this during respiration. We haven't talked about respiration, but we will on Monday. And this ATP is critical for photosynthesis. So I'm just going to put used in photosynthesis. I abbreviated photosynthesis because I didn't have room. So let's draw a large leaf here. So let's remind ourselves in which organisms photosynthesis occurs. We said this just a few moments ago, but let's write it down here again. It occurs in all plants. It occurs in some protists, like our green algae. It occurs in some bacteria, like our cyanobacteria. It does not occur in archaea, animals, or fungi. So here's a leaf structure of a plant, and this is where photosynthesis occurs. It doesn't occur in the bark, it occurs in the plants, in the green part of the plants. And so what makes these green? Well, it's due to the chloroplasts within these plants. And let's just, for simplicity, draw the chloroplasts as a circle here. It has an outer and an inner membrane, much like the mitochondria do. So let's label these. That's our outer membrane. And this green one here is our inner membrane. I can't imagine us ever asking it, but I'll go and label it anyhow. This is the inner membrane space. Within this space here, which we call the stroma, so let's go ahead and label that too. This is just on the inside of the chloroplast. We have stacks of membranes. I'm just going to draw them like this. These membrane structures are called the thylakoids. The stack of the thylakoids is called a granum. It is within these thylakoid that we have the pigment that's called chlorophyll. So it's kind of hard to draw this, but I'm going to try anyhow. Chlorophyll is a key pigment in these leaves that is essential for photosynthesis. I'm going to erase this structure of the chloroplast here. One thing I should point out is that the chloroplasts, just like the mitochondria, are part of this endosymbiotic theory, where probably some primitive protist engulfed a photosynthetic bacterium, which then became incorporated into that eukaryotic cell and became the chloroplast. All right, the next thing I want to do is to write the equation for photosynthesis. It requires 6 CO2 carbon dioxide molecules plus 6 water molecules, and that is converted then into 1 glucose and 6 oxygen molecules. We're not going to talk about respiration yet, but I think it's good to go ahead and talk about, at least introduce to you, how this is linked to respiration. So when we see it again, it'll maybe make a little bit more sense. This glucose, when an herbivore eats this plant, it consumes this glucose into its system, and it breathes in the oxygen. It uses this glucose and the oxygen during respiration. So let's just go ahead and write this here just so we keep it in our mind. This is fed right into respiration. A product of respiration is 6 CO2, the carbon dioxide, and water. So if we had respiration here, these are the products of respiration that feed right into photosynthesis. I should probably write photosynthesis here so we remember that this is the photosynthetic pathway. One thing I want to make sure it's clear is that within this plant cell, remember I said an herbivore has to eat this and then that triggers respiration. Well, it's also important to remember that within these plant cells, respiration also occurs. These plant cells also have mitochondria, which are necessary for respiration in eukaryotes. So plants can kind of do it all here. They photosynthesize and they undergo respiration. So they can keep this whole system going on and on and on. All right, I'm going to erase this real quick. And I want to sort of state it this way. This is kind of the big picture of photosynthesis. Okay, that ends our podcast, our first podcast for this day. If you have any questions, please let us know. See you in class. Bye.